And why so much aggression and so much unfortunate events? Oppression, wars, so much pain, governments killing their own people, and so much greed and betrayal. The material world is a place of duality. There is confusion everywhere and beauty everywhere. And we try to understand why we are here. We wish to be useful, for our lives to have meaning, and we would like to know what is really going on.
Don't be misused, because maybe some of these people are not really on the side of the poor.
To understand, we must look from a different perspective.
Our relationship for about 3 months, and then eventually I had occasion to add to my staff, and as a result of adding to my staff a top flight intelligence officer, both the Republican National Committee and the White House were resorted to stop me from continuing this investigation in the direction that Carol Reese had personally asked me to do, which was to utilize this investigation, Mr. Griffin, to uncover the fact that this country had been the victim of a conspiracy. That was Mr. Reese's conviction. I eventually agreed to carry it out. I explained to Mr. Reese that his own counsel wouldn't go in that direction. He gave me permission to disregard our own counsel. And I had then to set up an aspect of the investigation outside of our office, more or less secret. And the Republican National Committee got wind of what I was doing, and they did everything they could to stop me. They appealed to counsel to stop me, and finally they resorted to the White House.
Was there objection because of what you were doing, or because of the fact that you were doing it outside of the official auspices of the committee?
No, their objection was, as they put it, my devotion to what they call anti-Semitism. That was a cooked-up idea, but in other words, it wasn't true at all.
Someone who could be very, very healthy, bright enough to accomplish all the tasks, but not too bright to overthrow the dominant minority. That's what the utopia, or the utopic idea, is basically based upon. Some of them are so arrogant, like Julian Huxley, who was the first CEO of UNESCO, who said that UNESCO's function, by the way, the United Nations Organization for Education worldwide, was to create a standardized system of education across the world so that all children could be manipulated into the same thought patterns, belief patterns, and mentality, basically. A standardization process, a Plato's cave that would all grow up in, never knowing anything outside that cave. He was quite blatant about that. It was for social engineering purposes, not for educational purposes as such. Now, eugenics goes back, as I say, into most ancient times. All kings and queens were mated up for their supposedly inherited traits as leaders and even as gods by the priesthoods, who kept records of the traits, the physical and mental personality traits of offspring of these unions. The one thing that was lacking was a moneyed class who also used the same techniques. We find this coming out with the Rothschilds family. So you had monarchies running the world, running an empire such as the British Empire. All you needed now was the moneyed system to go along with it. We find the Rothschilds worked on the same principles as monarchies. They intermarried each other to keep the same intellects, abilities, and so on going. With the Rothschilds, we find they only marry their nieces, their immediate nieces, down through the generations. We find Benjamin Franklin, very interesting man long before this, again, high Freemason. This is in his own records at the Franklin Institute. He joined the English Lodge, he joined other lodges, he became eventually the Grand Master of the Nine Sisters Lodge in France. He initiated Voltairean as a member and others, but he was also a member of the Hellfire Club in England. Benjamin Franklin talks about the carriers, he called them dollies. These are women who had selective genes. They were the products themselves of selective special breeding. And the Hellfire Club, like many Masonic, high Masonic
before they're born, the damned who are 19 to 1 are damned before they're born, and no amount of good work or behavior can save the damned, and no amount of evil behavior can damn the saved. The expression that used to be pretty common, but has vanished, I think on purpose, is justified sinners. The saved are justified sinners who can do anything. They can carpet bomb civilian populations, whether they're Nazis or Americans. You know, you've done no harm according to Calvin. Calvin said the only way the elect, he called the saved, the elect will ever be safe because they're outnumbered so heavily, is to set up a system of universal compulsion schooling with the intention of destroying the imagination and filling the head with garbage. Spinoza said the same thing. Fichte said the same thing.
They also put together this curriculum for globalism, and the NEA did it. By the way, NEA at the top is in bed with David Rockefeller. I have all those documents from the NEA Cardinal Principles that leads that state that the NEA, when they did this Cardinal Principle project, in the back they have the pre-planning committee, and at the top they have David Rockefeller and McGeorge Bundy. Now, who would ever dream that the National Education Association, which one thinks of as being a leftist teachers union that hates kids and all that, and they're not, because most of the teachers in the union have to be there, and they don't hate kids, and they're not leftist, and they don't know anything about David Rockefeller running the NEA, right? They thought we were ready for that. And by golly, they found out we were not ready for that. And they made a big mistake because the media, and then everybody, all of us jumped on board. No, we don't want that. We got all our newsletters out and it went underground. You don't hear much about it anymore. That doesn't mean they're not busy. But the point I'm trying to make is that they're behind schedule. And I think we've got at least 10 years and maybe 20. But all of that, 20 years could disappear overnight if, like, a constitutional convention is approved. They're waiting for the conservatives to get us into a constitutional convention. If there's anything that we have to avoid, like the plague, it's the constitutional convention. And they're close to getting it. And I don't know how many votes short. Because if they get that, forget the 20 years we've got. Because then Carnegie will have its way. And as it said, we'll take your land. In the little blue book, it says that Americans are going to get sort of upset, when their land is taken from them. That's in the book. The words are there. This is the book that talks about using the schools to change America. And so that's why I keep asking.
And that's going to cost us $4 billion so that we can offset what we have given them. And this stupidity has continued stupidity in my sense. From the viewpoint of a Wall Street capitalist, I guess it's smart business. This has continued for 60 years.
And this supposedly by our allies, but this is not the people of Japan and Norway.
No.
This is again the internationalists.
It's the internationalists. Toshiba represented on the Trilateral Commission founded by David Rockefeller in 1973. It's your top corporate elitists, your top corporate establishment attorneys, the top politicians. Senator Mansfield once said, you don't get along unless you go along.
So we have to break away from King George and establish our own king. Right. Well, fortunately, the men that were drafting the Constitution,
Yes.
the Jeffersons and the Hamiltons and the Washingtons of the period, were extraordinarily wise.
Yeah.
It was a most amazing thing that those men who were being given an opportunity to become a new royalty
Sure.
in this country, not only an opportunity, but the people were clamoring for it, they said no. They said, this is not a question of good versus bad men. This is a question of the system. Yeah. This is the question of the laws or the concept of government. And so they, for the first time in history, drafted a form of government which started to put limitations on the power of the rulers. It's the first time that it had ever been done from the ground up.
So the Declaration of Independence basically was saying all the things wrong with King George III, and Mr. King George III was a collectivist, was he not?
He was a collectivist, but those were still the days where governments ruled primarily by force of arms. That was at the time in history when there was a change being made right after the French Revolution and after the Magna Carta, where the concept of the voice of the individual citizen being important, that was just beginning to surface.
Part of the Rothschild formula, and it's not just the Rothschilds involved in this is a class of people throughout history, figured out that it was wise to finance both sides of a war. That way you had control. And the monarchs knew that if they failed to pay back, the financiers would finance their enemies and their kingdom would be overrun. They always paid back their loans for that reason because they feared the consequences. And so this goes on, and this is how this whole banking system evolved, because it's based on the profits from war. And we can see it, once you understand it, you can see it at work even today. Nobody asks what these weapon systems cost. It doesn't make any difference. We're going to get it from the people somehow. Now, of course, they don't have to get it just from the coffers of the empires they overthrow. They get it from their people. They get it through taxation, and primarily they get it through that hidden taxation called inflation. Perhaps we'll come to that issue in a moment, but it's a form of taxation. It comes eventually from the people themselves. So what is the Rothschild formula? The model is that be totally objective, be totally unemotional about it. There's no merit in one side versus the other. It doesn't make any. They're all a bunch of evil people. Who can choose sides between two evil sides? We'll finance one side or the other. Doesn't make any difference as long as we make the money and we are in control. And somewhere down the path throughout all of this, the financiers become the controllers of the governments. And it was Rothschild, as you know, is quoted as saying, "Give me the power to make a nation's money, and I care not who passes its laws." And that's just as true today as ever before. If you can create the money, you can hire the people who pass the laws. That's it.
In 1967, the KGB attached me to this magazine, Look magazine. A group of 12 people arrived to USSR from United States to cover the 50th anniversary of October Socialist Revolution in my country. From the first page to the last page, it was a package of lies, propaganda cliché, which were presented to American readers as opinions and deductions of American journalists. Nothing could be far from truth. These were not opinions. They were not opinions at all. They were the clichés which the Soviet propaganda wants American public to think that they think. If it does make any sense at all. It sure does, because from the viewpoint of the Soviet propaganda, although there are some subtle criticism of the Soviet system, the basic message is that Russia today is a nice, functioning, efficient system supported by majority of population. That's the biggest lie. And of course, American intellectuals and journalists from Look magazine elaborated on that untruth in various different ways. They intellectualized that lie. They found all kinds of justifications for telling lies to American public.
Excuse me, it was partly your job to make sure that they got these ideas
Yes.
and accepted them as their own ideas.
Right. Actually, even before they arrived to USSR, and they paid astronomical sum of money for that visit, they were submitted, this Novosti Press agency developed so-called backgrounders, 20-25 pages of information and opinions which were presented to the journalists even before they bought their tickets to Moscow. They had to analyze the situation, and judging on their reaction to that backgrounder, the local Novosti representative or local Soviet diplomat in Washington, D.C. would assess whether they be given visa to USSR or not.
So they were selected ahead of time.
Oh yes, they were pre-selected very carefully, and there is not much chance for honest journalists to arrive to USSR and to stay there for 1 year and to bring this package of lies back home. This, for example, is a centerfold of the Look magazine. They presented this monument erected by Communist Party in Stalingrad as the symbol, personification of Russian military might. And they said in the article, which is published on the site, that Soviets are very proud of the victory in the Second World War. This is another big myth, a lie. No sensible people would be proud to lose 20 millions of their countrymen in a war which was started by Genoese Hitler and Comrade Stalin and paid by American multinationals. Most of the Soviet citizens look at this type of monuments with disgust and sorrow, because every family lost father, brother, sister, or child in the Second World War. Yet American journalists who were trying to appease, to please their hosts, presented this picture on the centerfold as the symbol and personification of Soviet national, they call it Russian national spirit. And it was greatest misconception and a very tragic misunderstanding. Of course, Look magazine was not distributed in USSR. The main audience was in the United States. But